Hey there, friends. Welcome to Curiosity Bridge. My name is Noel. This podcast is built on the idea that there's an opportunity for connection in each and every person. That connection, that bridge, is something that we cross through curiosity. When's the last time you had a really good vent session? I'm a high school teacher and I've come to the conclusion that I am bad at venting. I'm really good at assuming the posture of someone who's about to vent, but by the time I think through exactly what I want to say, I've talked myself out of it completely. Part of that is because I grew up hearing my mom tell me over and over again that no matter how rude, annoying, or unreasonable someone is in a particular moment, that they're living a life that I can't see. They have experiences that I can't know, and as a result, I can't make judgment calls on who they are as a person. I don't know if they can handle the venting at that moment. I don't know if they're the kind of person that I want to trust with those raw emotions at that point. It's even worse for me when I start thinking about venting about somebody in particular. Because even if I am really mad at them for some reason, I'm good at building these imaginary narratives in my head so that when I run into someone who's actually maybe worth complaining about, I automatically start thinking about the kind of life they may have had because I'm dramatic, at least in my mind, and the more unpleasant the experience I tend to have with people, the worse their life in my head tends to be. I'm sure part of this is due to my own experiences with being somebody worth complaining about. I'm the kind of person who tends not to complain about the little things, but I do let them build up. Like I was alluding to earlier, and next thing you know, I'm dumping all of my problems onto a poor, unsuspecting acquaintance trying to make polite small talk with me. I also know that I've had some stages in my life that were so bad that I was totally insufferable due to either how I handled my own suffering or how I failed to help other people handle theirs. With the benefit of hindsight, I'd love to tell past me to start working on better coping strategies, but it wouldn't be hindsight if I had those insights beforehand, I guess, so here we are. One of those hindsight moments came in preparation for this interview. I learned the term care seeker, as in the person opposite a caregiver. Oftentimes I've heard caregiver in the context of either professionals like nurses, teachers, doctors, the quote-unquote helping professions in general, or in the context of a family in need after a family tragedy or something like that. I've heard it in the context of people who have exceptional needs, kids with learning or cognitive challenges, aging family members, accidents, and other things. Hearing the term care seeker attached to it gave me a new context to use when thinking about my venting up to this point. When you vent something, I think of it like you're just sort of opening the gasket and letting the air out. And when you're letting that air out, yeah, there's an initial release of pressure, but if you've got so much pressure building up, something else is happening there too. When we use the term care seeker, it gives agency to those in need of care. We're talking about solutions that are a little more long-term than just releasing the pressure for a little bit. Care seeking goes a little bit deeper. When those people do find care, ideally they're finding it in a way that they feel suits their needs and is effective. So in this world where people may choose to seek and give care intentionally, what does it mean to be someone who is taking on the mantle of caregiver? Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you please tell us your name and what you do?
My name is Lara Shannon, and I work as a spiritual health practitioner at the Alberta Children's Hospital.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Lara. Now, when you describe your job to people, how do you describe that to them?
Well, when I introduce myself in a patient's room, I say that I'm part of the healthcare team, and that we, as spiritual health practitioners, provide emotional and spiritual support to all the families here, whether or not they're religious or spiritual. And we talk about things like meaning, purpose, hope, fear, grief, whatever is going on in the heart.
Yeah, awesome. Now, I got to see a picture of some of the stuff that you and your colleagues do, and one of the phrases that jumped out at me was the idea of attending to and listening to care seekers' stories.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for you, what does that mean?
Well, in my context, the stories are often about what brought them to the hospital, what it's been like since they've been here, what kind of feelings they've been having around having a sick child, and just what they're doing to cope with that, and attending to that. It's just providing a very focused and empathetic presence, and very deep listening, so that they feel comfortable just sharing what they're going through.
No, I'm lucky because the longest my children have ever been in the hospital for is maybe a day at the most. But about how far into somebody's hospital visit would they have to be before potentially seeing one of the spiritual health practitioners?
Well, that depends on a lot of factors. There's only 2 of us here in the entire hospital. And a lot of the staff they might misunderstand what we do and think it's specifically if someone has a religious question. Just because we kind of come from the Christian chaplain background, although it's been evolving probably for 30 years. It takes time for the understanding to catch up. But normally, for those staff who are really familiar with what they do, if they notice signs of spiritual distress, they'll send us a referral right as they notice that. And that's often when people first get here.
Okay. Now, one of the questions I suppose that I have is this concept of end-of-life care. And another word that I learned fairly recently actually is anticipatory grief. And so I think end-of-life care, I feel like I understand what that means, but can you walk us through what end-of-life care means?
Well, from a spiritual health perspective, it means so many different things, depending on people's perception of death, different cultural practices, different religious practices, and different levels of comfort with that. When you're supporting an adult who is dying, it's completely different than when you're supporting a child and their family. It's kind of hard to explain just how different, but it's a whole other world, really.
Now, again, within your lens, what is anticipatory grief?
That is when you know that you're going to die, or that your child is going to die, or that you know that there's going to be a huge shift in your life. Because of course that can cause grief too, things like divorce, or losing a job, or kids moving to a different city and losing contact with their friends. Just knowing that this is coming will send, especially when it's your child that's going to die, it just sends you into all of the stages of grief. And those stages aren't as linear as we once thought. So you can jump from shock to denial to anger to bargaining, and then back to anger, and then forward to acceptance, and then back to bargaining. It's very messy, and it's very different for different people.
Now, for you, in your opinion, why do you think being able to speak to this and to manage this, whether it is you personally dealing with the grief or in the work that you do, why is this so important for people?
I think having someone like a spiritual health practitioner walk beside you as you're going through this, it's really comforting for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
You might discover, inner resources you didn't even know you have, because the person that you're sitting with, the spiritual health practitioner, is just asking really open-ended questions and providing space and compassion that lets you just kind of go to a deeper level than you otherwise may have. And we're trained not to fix or to make things all better, which really allows people that space to process rather than trying to jump ahead to accepting or, things are better, they'll get better, or things are worse for other people. We don't encourage that. It's more of a, you are where you're at and we're here with you.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned your training. What kind of training would one need in order to sort of start stepping into this world? Would it be the same as psychology or an offshoot of that, or something else? What does that look like?
Well, you need to have a master's degree, and it's preferably from a theological school.
Mm-hmm.
Although that is opening up a lot. There's people with master's degrees in religious studies or, some other master's degree that isn't necessarily from a theological school.
Yeah.
But I'd say most people do go to a theological school traditionally, which I did. I went to the Vancouver School of Theology. And so I took a very specific degree in public and pastoral leadership in spiritual care,
Mm-hmm.
which was new when I started about 4 or 5 years ago. And then you have to have 4 units of CPE. And CPE it used to be called clinical pastoral education, but they've recently changed it to clinical psychospiritual education, again, to be more inclusive of all different kinds of religions and people who are not religious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is a very intense program. Each unit of CPE has a part that is very introspective, a part where you work closely with other students to discover parts of yourself that you didn't necessarily know existed. Yeah, it's really intense. And then a practicum at interspersed with these. So, for example, I did my CPE in intense units. So for 3 months, I would be 3 days a week at a hospital, and then 2 days a week doing courses and work with fellow students.
Okay. So what led you to this in the first place, if you don't mind me asking?
A couple of things. My husband's mother passed away, and we had support from a spiritual health practitioner at the hospice where she was. And it was just so meaningful and beautiful for me and my husband and the entire family to have the support from this wonderful practitioner. And my husband is a well, my ex-husband now is a spiritual health practitioner, and he would come home every day and share a bit about his day. And I would just find myself saying over and over again, oh, that sounds amazing. I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I did.
Awesome. I remember my mom passed away about 13 years ago, but I remember in hospice, and I don't think this was someone paid. I think it was someone volunteering at the hospice, but her name was Dawn. And Dawn would come in really just to help support what I guess I would call now, with some new vocabulary, is that anticipatory grief. And so what they would do is they would chat for a bit. And at the time, my mom wasn't strong enough to paint or anything like that, but Dawn would bring an easel and bring paints, and she would paint while talking with my mom, and my mom would make requests and things like that for the paintings. So when I learned about your job and the work that you do, that was the first thing that came to mind. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the most important part of what you do?
That's a great question. I think it's putting aside my own beliefs and values and thoughts and being fully present with the care seeker in what they need. And so it's just being able to be there in a way that, takes my ego or my perception of how things should be in the world and just puts it aside and just listen. Yeah, I think that's the most important part. I mean, the other parts are very important too, but.
Now, with that in mind, because I'm sure you've heard this before, when people are going through grief, often friends and family are trying to find a good way to support them, but don't have that training, don't have that education, more likely than not. And so for people who are experiencing grief, either themselves or seeing a friend or a family member go through this kind of stuff, are there things that we can do to either support ourselves more or support people who we see experiencing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind. I think that when we try and make ourselves more comfortable by trying to cheer someone up or trying to, just get over the emotions, or if we're grieving, if we've been brought up with that idea that it's not okay to express our emotions, that it's not okay to make someone else uncomfortable with our tears or our anger, or I think we miss that important step in processing grief. I think being where you're at with your emotions, allowing them to flow, is so important when you're processing grief. Otherwise, I think it gets stored up and it comes out some other way, and it ends up being hard on your whole system. Yeah. Either physically, emotionally. So I think if we want to support someone who's going through anticipatory grief or who has gone through a loss, to just ask them some questions about how they're doing and just sit with them and just be with them and allow them to feel what they need to feel. There's also some really great resources about ritual. Ritual is really not part of our as much a part of our world. Our world is much more secular than it used to be. And so there are books on ways of reincorporating ritual into your life that help with grief, and getting support from a grief counselor, for example, or someone who's been trained. It's really, really helpful.
Yeah. Do you think there's a time limit for dealing with grief in that sense?
No, absolutely not. No. I had a friend who recently went through the grief support program. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was developed by a spiritual health practitioner named Bob Glasgow. And it's, anyways, he lost his mom when he was 16, and he was in his mid-40s when he realized that it was still affecting him.
Wow.
He went and did the grief support program, and it was really profound.
That's awesome. Okay. Now, is there anything that you feel like you want people to know, whether that's about your work or your story or grief?
Well, we're all going to go through it.
True. Very true.
So I guess self-compassion. Self-compassion. It's hard, and it's okay to fall apart. You will get put back together again.
Yeah.
It's okay to feel the heartbreak. You will eventually be able to carry on with life, and it's never going to go away completely, but you somehow grow through the process.
Yeah. Now, this is the last question that I have, at least written down here, but what are you curious about? And I mean this in the broadest, most general sense. So you can answer in any way that you want.
Oh, I'm curious about so many things. What happens after we die? Where do we go? I've heard so many stories of people who've had near-death experiences or who've died and been resuscitated. And so many of them are really similar. They've seen bright light. They've heard the voices or seen people and pets who have passed before them.
Yeah.
They felt surrounded by love, and they've heard a voice tell them it's not their time. And it just, when you're sitting across from someone who's telling you this in such a heartfelt, authentic way, it just really, it makes me curious, this mysteriousness of reality. And yeah, I'm curious about that.
It's a big question, but I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, Lara, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all the work that you do. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I started looking into the history of caregiving a little bit, and there are a few things that came up that I feel like had a lot of context, at least for me, and I think it's worth thinking about. Historically, as I'm sure you're all aware of, caregiving is a profession that was thought of primarily as quote-unquote women's work. We also know that caregiving tends to carry risk to caregivers. There's a limit to how much someone can give before it begins to impact the other aspects of their life. A research paper published in 1998 called Caregiver Burden, Historical Development by Rosemary L. Hoffman and Anne M. Mitchell goes into the different impacts of caregiving on people in the long term. In this paper, they attribute the modern context of caregiving to people like Florence Nightingale and the American Civil War, which might need an episode all on its own because I don't nearly know enough to give a proper context on that. But leaning on women as caregivers seems to be a factor for a lot of reasons. One being age. In quote-unquote traditional marriages of the past, the female partner was often younger and healthier than their male counterpart. We also see these responsibilities landing often with eldest daughters, or at least the eldest unmarried daughters in a family. And just to be clear here, although this is referencing mostly North American history, this might play out in other ways in other cultures around the world. In these cases of informal caregiving, these women were essentially asked to do the work of a full-time live-in nurse, but without the wage or the training. There's no place for additional support because that place is ideally at home. But home is where everyone is relying on you and thus not restful. So what we end up with is women who are doing all this work historically, who have no training, they have no help, and they have no respite. Another observation made in these papers was that additional support for these women tended to be tied to income. If the wife or eldest daughter is caring for someone, they are likely caring for someone who was formerly the breadwinner of the household. If the breadwinner needs care, they can't work. No work means no money for additional support for the essentials for anything. And so being a caregiver was a burden that was incredibly difficult to manage, and in a lot of cases still is right now in the modern day. It seems in the studies mentioned, the primary source of burden for female caregivers at this time was based on the emotional struggles and struggles with resources. Too much to do, not enough supplies, not enough time, not enough help to make it happen. Further on, they talk about the roles of males as primary caregivers. As noted in the paper, since there are significantly fewer studies on male caregivers, there is significantly less data. In the studies mentioned, the men seem to deal with the additional responsibilities, especially in the context of supporting a loved one. As far as tasks on a list or a to-do list of some sort, that part went pretty well. That's not to say that there were no burdens for males. Quite the contrary, it seems the burden, as mentioned, for men was primarily an emotional one. Similar to the scenarios that we've talked about already, if somebody is working, getting home, and then caring for somebody, then there's going to be a lot of feelings of frustration, agitation, and overwhelm. There is even less research about child caregivers, as well as caregivers in same-sex relationships, but the verdict seems to be pretty similar overall. It's really hard. Caregiving requires somebody to give of themselves in a way that there's not a lot of place to recharge. Because the place that you recharge is home. But if you're caregiving for somebody at home, then your place for recharge has to be somewhere else, or it just doesn't exist. One thing that I am really curious about to know more is the role that this plays in cultures outside of North America. My family is from Haiti, and I grew up understanding that the odds of a parent living with me when I am older are pretty high. The researchers acknowledge the difficulty in studying caregiver burden because in some languages, there's actually no equivalent even for the name burden. They mention the word heaviness as the closest approximation in Mexico and the phrase "my cross to bear" in Spain. In Haitian culture, we were raised understanding that our duty is to care for the elderly if we can. It's supposed to be a shared duty that all the children have. The research mentions Amish and Puerto Rican cultures treasuring the opportunities to care for the elderly as an honor. I don't want to oversimplify caregiving, but I think we in these richer nations especially have a lot we can learn about what it means to give care and how that learning might increase the quality of life for everybody involved. Lara and I had a wonderful conversation after the recording was done about the importance of the work that she does and the impact that it has on people. I've come to better appreciate the idea of care seekers in relationship with caregivers beyond the needs that are fulfilled by professionals in specific situations. Because in one form or other, we're all giving care, we are all seeking care. How we interact with one another as friends and family, overly friendly airplane passengers, and the curious senior at the park always asking me why I'm at the park with my kids, but without my wife. It's all care-seeking or caregiving in one form or another. Some people have the desire and the ability to be caregivers to these folks, but not everybody. So as I've been going through this stuff, here's some questions that I've been asking myself that I would encourage you to ask yourself. As a care seeker, what do you need? At the core of how you are, how are you feeling? How do you even figure out how you're feeling and what you need? I am bad at that. I don't have any good answers, but I think the question is worth asking for those who are ready to give care. To whom and to what extent? Because while you might feel like a caring person, it's human nature. I don't think that care is able to extend universally to everybody. Do you have boundaries around it? And what does it look like for you to seek care if you're in need of it after giving care? Regardless, I hope you take some time to really thinking about what care means for you right now, what kind of care you need, what kind of care you can give, and then you can use that to interact with the people around you in whatever way you feel like you're ready to do. And that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for sharing in this story with me. My name is Alex Noel. If you liked the episode, let me know what you liked. I'm relatively new to all this, so I'd appreciate some constructive feedback. Is it worth it for me to upload an actual video as well with the audio? Would you rather this be on something like Spotify or Apple Podcasts? Let me know what you think. Feel free to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more episodes. Stay curious, stay connected, and thanks for crossing that bridge with us today.